could have given on the cloud question from the midterm was exactly related to this. Because the cloud, it used to be that to start like, you know, a tech company, you had to like build a giant set of servers to serve all the people who would use your application. Now, if you host everything on the cloud, basically, if you've programmed the thing right, within a week you can be serving half the planet. Because you just rent it and it just all goes onto the cloud, it propagates. And so that's made it much cheaper to enter and exit industries and really reduce the fixed cost of entry. So we should expect these type of contestability arguments to be much more relevant in something like the tech sector where the fixed costs have come down a lot than in other sectors. Okay, so why is marginal cost and average cost, marginal cost pricing more efficient than average cost pricing? Well, average costs are just not marginal costs, right? And marginal cost equals price is the efficiency condition, right? So when marginal cost, precisely when marginal cost pricing leads to losses, it's because the average cost is above the marginal cost, right? And thus average cost pricing leads to a higher price than marginal cost pricing does, and therefore too little will be produced if the average cost prices are charged. This is not really dissimilar from a monopoly distortion, but it's not as extreme as a monopoly distortion. Because a monopolist always wants to earn positive profits, right? And so their prices will be above their average cost, so they will cause even more distortions. Whereas average cost pricing causes somewhat less in this case. And the wedge, the social loss, is the difference between the average cost and the marginal cost, right? And so we can calculate the losses just using the standard Harberger triangle, right? So the difference between average cost and marginal cost is the slope of average cost minus the negative of the slope of average cost times quantity, right? How do we know that? Does anyone want to remind us how we know that? Well, this was just the story about my wife, right? You know, the marginal cost drags the average cost, right? So if average cost is falling, that means the marginal cost is below the average cost, right? And so you'll notice this looks a heck of a lot like the monopoly distortion, right? Price is average revenue, and it was P prime times Q that was the monopoly distortion. And the adverse selection, I mean the distortion from average cost pricing is average cost prime times Q. So in one case it's average revenue prime times Q, in the other case it's average cost prime times Q. And the marginal distortion caused by this is therefore proportional both to the size of the market and to the slope of the average cost curve. So if the average cost curve is flat, this doesn't cause a distortion. If the average cost curve is declining, then the prices are too high. If the average cost curve is increasing, then if you had average cost pricing, the prices would be too low, right? So what this means is that natural monopolies could still be harmful if they price at average cost, even when the marginal cost is greater than the average cost, because that would mean they actually would charge too low of a price. So if we're in a part where the marginal costs are actually increasing, then actually average cost regulation could lead the price to be too low rather than to be too high. Yeah?
That's a situation of like positive selection instead of like advantageous.
Yeah, well, we'll get into that in the insurance market, but you can even just think of it in a normal regulated industry. You know, we could so if that's the average cost curve and we're operating somewhere like this, and the marginal cost is therefore somewhere like that, right? So it was right? Then the optimal price would be here. But if we institute average cost regulation, then there's actually too much of the good consumed, because the price is too low, because the marginal, and that could still be a natural monopoly. So natural monopolies, just like the selection case, can also have cases where average cost pricing actually leads to too low of a price rather than too high. So here's a graph of this in the standard case where there's too high of a price under average cost pricing because there's economies of scale all the way through, right? So the average cost curve here is this line. The marginal cost curve lies below it, right? Because it's dragging it down. Social optimum would be where this white demand curve intersects the marginal cost curve, but the private optimum is where the demand curve intersects the average cost curve, or the equilibrium slash average cost pricing. And so the distortion is this Harberger triangle, right? It's the area between the marginal cost and the demand, between the optimum and the equilibrium. Okay. So, at least as important of a problem with average cost pricing is the longer term incentives that it gives. Companies can very easily affect their costs in many situations by making efforts, say, to cut costs or workers, by innovating to make production processes more efficient, by choosing cheaper rather than more expensive ways of producing things. And the problem set basically asks you to look at why this causes problems for average cost pricing. So unless all of these can be monitored or controlled by the regulator, the problem is that under average cost pricing, the firm basically has no incentive to try to reduce its costs, right? Because if it's always forced to pay, if it never makes any profits, right, then by reducing its costs, it doesn't make any more profits, right? So that can be very inefficient, and again, you'll look at that in the problem set. One particularly extreme example of this is that imagine that your regulator learns about what your costs are from what your costs are this year, right? So a classic example of this is budgeting by places within the federal government. My father once worked okay, so let me explain the effect first. So if they're learning about this, you're going to have a giant incentive to try to make your costs look big, because then you'll get a big budget in the future years, right? And so this happens a lot with government agencies. So my father was working for a defense contractor, and they made a proposal to some general in the Army to design some weapon system, and they were like 50% under budget. And the guy said to him, I like your proposal, but I would absolutely be neglecting my duty to this nation if I spent 1 penny less than the budget that was allocated for this, right? Because he knew that if he spent 1 penny less than the budget that was allocated, next year they would have half the budget, right? And so this quite often happens. It's called the ratchet effect. And that's another problem that's created by average cost pricing, right? And that is true of all the other reasons why average cost pricing occurs. It's not just true of regulation. So when a company innovates, if it doesn't make any additional profits because of that, because everything gets driven to average cost, they have no incentive to innovate, right? And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about on Tuesday. Okay, so one important source of nonlinear costs is selection. By nonlinear costs, I mean a downward sloping or upward sloping marginal cost curve, right? We talked about this in lecture 3, but let's go back through the idea again. Let's let Q be the fraction of the population covered with, let's say, health insurance, or given a loan, or anything else where different people have different costs of being covered. And P is the prevailing price, right? And the reason why costs are nonlinear in this situation is that different people have different amount of risk. So under adverse selection, the first people to enter the market are the riskiest, right? So the first people to buy insurance, even at a high price, are the people who are really expensive to cover. And the people who buy it as the price comes down are the ones who are less sick. And Stieg, what does that imply about the slope of the marginal and average cost curves?
guess slope should be somewhat downward sloping because the cost is highest at the first because it's the people that are adversely selecting will come in first.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the marginal and average cost curves slope downward. On the other hand, we can think of advantageous selection as being a case where, say, the most risk averse or the most educated or the most health conscious or the most concerned about their future people are the first ones to enter the market, right? So imagine, like, you're giving out loans, and the first people who want to get loans are the people who are most ambitious and want to accomplish the most in their life, and the later people are people who are less good. Yeah, Edward.
How often does it happen that you have advantageous selection?
More often than you'd think. So in fact, we'll look at some data. We'll look at some data a week from today, which indicates that in like subprime mortgages, it's basically advantageous selection. That like at the relatively high prices, only the people who are quite likely to pay do it, and then at lower prices, more people who are dangerous borrowers get into the market.
So like in the subprime like mortgage crisis, so like what happened then?
Well, I mean, it's complicated because this data comes from auto loans, but you might think that because there was so much credit available, it was starting to be offered to people who couldn't really repay, right? And so that's a classic example of advantageous selection, right? When it was only being offered to a few people, those people were likely to repay. When it gets offered to more people, then those people are less likely to repay, right? So that's a good example of advantageous selection. So, Alex, what slope do the curves have if there's advantageous selection?
It would just be the opposite.
Yeah, they just slope. They slope upward, right? Another example of advantageous selection that I think is quite important is like often uneducated people or people who aren't very health conscious aren't interested in insurance. They sort of think they'll live forever or whatever. They just don't think about it very much. And those people also don't usually take very good care of their health. And so that can lead to advantageous selection in the insurance market. And also there could be a mixture of this. These curves don't have to be monotone. They could be increasing and decreasing and so forth. So things could get quite complicated. So note that when we're talking about the cost curve here, this is not the cost curve of one individual firm. This is the cost curve of the market as a whole, right? This is the total cost to society of supplying the industry. Because insurance is sort of a social concern, we can think about the market in these terms of average and marginal cost. Yeah, David?
There's a debate around whether insurance companies should exclude pre-existing conditions from the pool that they cover. Is that related to trying to mitigate this advantageous selection?
Yeah, we're going to talk through that a little bit more in a bit, or adverse selection as well, right? Yeah, so we'll talk through that in a bit. So unless they discriminate in the way that David is suggesting, right, an insurer gets a representative sample of the population pretty much showing up to buy their insurance plan, right? And so in this case, if I'm an insurer thinking about coming in and offering something, I have to pay the average cost of covering people, not the marginal cost of covering the next person, right? So if I'm a small insurance company in a big industry, I'm just going to attract, a pretty representative group of people. And so what that means is that equilibrium with free entry is exactly average cost pricing, right? If I come in and offer my insurance, I'm going to pay the average cost, and I've got to cover those average costs, so I basically charge a price that's equal to that. So for exactly the same reasons, exactly the same as why regulating things to average cost causes inefficiencies, similarly, in equilibrium in the insurance market can cause inefficiencies, right? It's literally just the same as average cost pricing. When selection is advantageous, then there's going to be too much insurance, too many loans made, right? So the subprime thing could be seen as an example